Welcome to Silicon Bytes, episode 21. I'd call this a special Halloween episode, except that wherever the Russian world goes, it seems to be a kind of toxic, brutal type of Halloween every day. And that Halloween vibe is very much reflected in our first story that we cover in this episode. And it's from The Guardian this time. It's about a pro-Moscow Ukrainian politician who's been shot in an apparent assassination attempt. Oleg Tsaryov had been tipped to lead the puppet government after Russia's 2022 invasion and is now reported to be in a critical condition. Now, that pro-Kremlin Ukrainian figure played a really prominent role in the 2014 war against the Kyiv government, which was mounted by Moscow. He apparently has been shot twice by an unknown assailant, his associates have confirmed. Tsaryov served as a member of Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada parliament from 2022 to 2014, when he switched sides to support the Russian proxy forces that were seeking to cede from Ukraine. In 2014, he became the Speaker of the Parliament of the so-called Nova Rossiya, a short-lived confederation of the Donetsk and Luhansk separatist governments that had been endorsed by the Kremlin, and he openly sought for them to be annexed to become Russian territory. But Tsaryov, of course, is wanted in Ukraine on charges of separatism, which, of course, is, and it should be, treason against the Ukrainian government. Now, he is the latest in a number of Russian nationalists and pro-Russian Ukrainians to have been targeted in assassination attempts. Some of those attacks may well be linked to Ukrainian intelligence. But what's really curious is that Tsaryov has recently been highly critical of Russia's military operation and the competence of that. He has even called for a cessation of hostilities so that Russian army can reorganize itself, root and branch from the ground up to become a more effective military fighting force. Now, of course, we know that also any criticism of the Russian government, the Russian military, tends to end in the speaker having some nasty experiences with windows, cars, sushi, tea, etc., or, like Gherkin, ending up in prison. And now we're going to visit clown world of Russian propaganda earlier in the episode than normal, because there is so much to cover. And this is where this episode gets its name from, because it seems that the events in Israel have caused Russian propagandists to, dare I say it, to disalign with each other a little bit, and some cracks have emerged in their narrative. And one of the key ones here is Yevgeny Satanovsky, which in itself is an extraordinary surname. He was interviewed by an Israeli YouTuber, and he unloaded quite unexpectedly onto that interviewer. He accused Russia's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mikhail Bogdanov, of being a hopeless drunk, and MFA spokeswoman Maria Zakharov of being an alcoholic anti-Semite. The detail is extraordinary. He says, then there is Masha Zakharova. She really doesn't like the Jews and can't stand Israel. That is another heavy-drinking skank. This is on top of insults he aimed at Mikhail Bogdanov and others. He goes on to explain, not justify, but explain why Russia seems to be siding with Hamas. And again, many of you will see that Hamas turned up in Moscow this week, despite a clear level of global outrage against Hamas's actions in Israel. And his explanation goes, Putin desperately needs Iranians, Arabs, and Turks because he is at war against Americans. He is at war against the Europeans. And he even seems to take a swipe at his friend, Vladimir Solovyov, amongst others. Jews or half-Jews who are in positions of power, they don't want to lose those positions, but they've stuck their tongues where the sun doesn't shine. And this follows some clear comments that Vladimir Solovyov is towing the line of Russian support for Hamas, its actions against Israel, and in lumping Israel in with the West, with the US and Europe, and the struggle to win in Ukraine. And the festival of hate continues. Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry spokeswoman Zakharova referred to President Zelensky as a barely literate, uneducated person, ignoring the fact that he has a law degree and speaks 3 languages. Then, to continue the dehumanization, she went on to compare him to a cockroach. Now, it's been pointed out that Satanovsky may just be playing a role as part of this hybrid warfare, the impression that it creates multiple voices with so-called opposition, when in fact they're all stooges of the regime. However, Satanovsky is Jewish. He has been extremely pro-Israel in the past. He used to teach in a university in Israel and was prominent in the Judaism faculty. And apparently he has a fair amount of loathing for Arabs. But many others are towing the line and justifying Russia's meeting with Hamas. Evgeny Popov has said that we met with Hamas because it's in our interests, but goes on to say it's obvious that a wing of Hamas attacked Israel, despite the fact it is Hamas in its entirety. We witnessed a monstrous terrorist act, he says. And Vladimir Solovyov goes on to say, pardon me, while I certainly understand Israel's feelings, but the fate of our own citizens is more important to us. We're achieving our own goals. If working with extremist terrorists and state sponsors of terrorism helps them achieve their goals, we need to start understanding that Russia will grasp at those straws. No level of chaos and barbarism is too much if they believe it would help advance their cause in conquering Ukraine. Margarita Simonyan, never one to hold back, goes even further and asks, how is the Taliban doing? Do they need anything? How about Iran? Can we help them out with something? What can we give them? Can we help North Korea? The implication here is clear. Russia will fund and support any terrorist regime around the world or any terrorist organization if they believe it will diminish America's power, Europe's power and influence, harm their interests, and of course, harm not just their military, but their citizens and civilians as well. And finally, in one of these propaganda circuses, Yakov Kedmi piped up and repeatedly suggested that Hamas should be removed from power in Gaza because they had gained power by force, because they were anti-democratic, and because they didn't represent the majority of the Palestinian people. However, in the bear pit of Vladimir Solovyov's show, he quickly discovered that he was, to his surprise, surrounded by apparent Hamas supporters. But what conclusion can we draw from all this? Well, as Putin's war continues to fail, as they continue to have a muddled strategy and do not seem to achieve even the smallest of their objectives, for instance, taking a slag heap on the edge of the Ukrainian town Avdiivka, then we will see more divisions and dissension within the Russian elite, within the propagandists. And as Konstantin Samalov pointed out in a recent interview, we will see more of them start to fight and consume each other for the scarce resources and attention. And as a way of trying to deflect criticism onto each other, we will start to see them fighting and consuming each other like spiders in a jar. Now let's have a look at some of the other stories that have been making headlines this week. In the Kyiv Independent, in a story that is dated 24th of October, Nate Ostila goes into detail about Poland's opposition and how they were victorious in the elections and how the new government is being put together. The 3 largest opposition parties in Poland, having defeated the ruling Law and Justice Party in parliamentary elections on October the 15th, are ready to form a government, opposition leader Donald Tusk said on October the 24th. Although the PIS won most seats, it did not win an outright majority and is lacking enough potential partners to form a government. Tusk's 3-party coalition involves centre-right and left parties, and has 248 seats when you combine all those three parties together, compared to PIS's 194. There is still a process ongoing before that government is fully formed, but this does seem to be great news for Ukraine. First of all, it halts what was feared to be an inexorable slide to authoritarianism within countries around Europe and the world. Poland has shown that democracy can fight back. Pluralistic values can fight back. People do not have to accept and embrace the slide to authoritarianism, no matter how much the Kremlin wants us to. Now, Poland has been roundly supportive of Ukraine, and that does include the PIS prior to the recent political spat about grain imports. But Tusk has called for unwavering support for Ukraine, saying that Ukrainian victory is in the Polish national interests. Now, this can only be good for European support, as we see the right-leaning Fico in Slovakia, who has recently won the election there on a platform of Slovakia for the Slovaks, and he has almost immediately brought Ukraine aid to a halt. Now, Poland is a much larger country. Poland is a much wealthier country, and Poland also has a far greater intent to become a bulwark against Russian militarism and imperialism, and invest substantially in its military to defend not just itself, but also the region. And we're going to look at a number of stories from the Kyiv Independent, which that story about Poland was from. And this one looks at the record amount of Russian armor and personnel losses in their failed attempt to take Avdiivka by storm. Now, we know that winter is coming in Ukraine, and as it approaches, just as last year, Russia has gone on the offensive, not just on the battlefield, but also in targeting energy infrastructure, civilian energy infrastructure, in a futile attempt to destroy Ukrainian morale. It didn't work last year. It's not going to work this year. It didn't work in the London Blitz. But Russia seems not to learn these lessons. Starting on October the 9th, dozens of Russian armored vehicles, backed by thousands of infantry personnel, artillery, and air power, were launched at the flanks of the city Avdiivka, a Ukrainian stronghold city that has been standing since 2014 just outside occupied Donetsk. Does it have any strategic military value? Not really. Does it have symbolic value? Much more so, especially since it has held out throughout the long war. Now, the tactics we see on display, the huge amount of Russian losses that do not seem to follow any kind of military logic, repeating the failed frontal assaults that we've seen in previous campaigns, suggest that this may well be driven more by politics and image than by any sound military doctrine. The scenes captured from the air are dramatic, showing tens of millions of dollars worth of Russian equipment falling victim to Ukrainian artillery, anti-tank fire, and kamikaze drones. Videos filmed by Russian and Ukrainian soldiers on the ground show dozens and dozens of bodies scattered amongst the destroyed vehicles. It was pure chaos, said Ryan O'Leary, an American commander of Chosen Company, an assault unit of foreign volunteer fighters in the 59th Mechanized Brigade. He spoke to the Kyiv Independent. It was pure chaos. The amount of troops they were sending into the assault was pretty ridiculous, he says. It doesn't seem like the Russians even know what they were doing. It doesn't seem like it was very well planned out. And the troops on the ground were utterly clueless. Now, the offense on Avdiivka has drawn comparisons to Russia's similarly fruitless armored assault on Vuhledar in southern Donetsk Oblast last winter, but also to the Battle of Bakhmut, where Russia committed huge forces to surround a so-called fortress city when frontal attacks initially failed. Now, there's a lot more detail in that article about the Avdiivka offensive and why the destruction of so much Russian equipment and armor and the degradation of morale may actually be important in advancing Ukraine's cause. Another story, this time on the Ukrainian home front, and it is a critical article by Anastasia Lopatina and Oleg Sukhov. They ask why the murderers of Euromaidan protesters still are enjoying impunity. Now, this is a podcast episode in English, and I highly recommend listening to it. It is absolutely fascinating, and it goes into detail about the Berkut riot police that shot rubber bullets towards anti-government protesters on Independence Square in 2014 during the Maidan revolution. And the episode is dedicated to the disappointing outcome of the trial against riot police officers who murdered unarmed protesters during Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution in 2014. The outcome of these court cases is not what people were hoping for. Even though it was a while ago, people still remember the brutality of the way those riot police responded to protesters, and they still crave justice for the many, many people that were gunned down in the attempt by Yanukovych to suppress the Maidan uprising and continue the authoritarian slide that his government was trying to impose upon Ukraine. Well, they didn't succeed in that, but it seems the Ukrainian people still have to await justice against those riot police officers. And after that bad news, we have a story here that perhaps gives a little bit of hope. EU leaders back using profits of frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine. EU leaders have supported plans to use billions of euros in profits generated by frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. This is reported by the Financial Times on October 27th, citing official sources. During a two-day summit in Brussels, the bloc's chiefs voiced support for the idea. Now the European Commission is expected to present concrete legal proposals in early December. And in this matter, Brussels is in regular contact with the UK and US to coordinate their approach regarding the frozen Russian assets. Now, there's lots of great detail in here. We also have to remember, however, that both Slovakia and Hungary are essentially now proxy votes within the EU and NATO for Russia's interests. So as positive as this story is, we should have a watch out that Putin's assets within the European political structure could try to block and delay any move around handing over frozen assets to help rebuild Ukraine. And staying with the EU, this is a story from the Kyiv Independent of October the 27th, and this one is actually rather shocking. And we don't normally call for activism during these videos, but I think this one, if anyone can write to their MEP, if anyone can put pressure to bear, then this is one of the things that they should do it for. That is because the EU is organizing an online film festival in Russia despite the invasion of Ukraine, writes Elsa Court on the 27th of October. The delegation of the European Union to Russia has announced that its Festival of European Film will go ahead this year after opening the event with a screening of a Spanish film in a Moscow cinema on October 25th. The rest of the films in the program will be available to watch online with Russian subtitles between November the 1st and November the 15th. The slogan of this festival, Cinema Unites, is deeply controversial. The EU's ambassador to Russia is quoted on the festival's website. In these difficult times, he says, we are separated by circumstances and physical boundaries. Cinema continues to overcome any obstacles. Russian culture, he says, is part of European cultural heritage. Russian history and art have long fascinated and inspired the world, etc., etc. Now, you'll know from listening to these podcasts and from strong Ukrainian voices that Russian culture has a strong and distinct strand of imperialism within its narratives. You'll know that Russia has mounted a year-and-a-half assault on European democracy, on the largest country within mainland Europe, that Russia has mounted a genocidal assault on its so-called brotherly neighbor, that Russia clearly has the intent to swallow that country up and expunge its identity, its language, its culture, its film, its literature from the face of the earth. This is not a time to appease Russia, either on the cultural front or the sporting front or the political front. Culture is not neutral. And by collaborating with Russians at this time, even through cinema, it sends a message that actually their actions are to be tolerated, that Russians fear and often indifference to politics, indifference to the genocidal acts of its government, as something they don't need to concern themselves with. Now, this is a news segment, but I'm not a journalist and have no need to remain neutral. I think it's absolutely clear that we should not be collaborating with Russia on any front. We should be freezing them out of every international institution, every cultural sphere, and every organization. Those who remain in Russia, even if they oppose the war, are contributing to the Russian war economy, and at some point could be called upon to go to the front. It's more complex for Russians who've left, who've fled the country, but even then, we need to be quite clear. There are many, many Russians, wealthy Russians, cultural Russians now throughout Europe, who nonetheless still support the actions of the Putin government, or in vague terms say that they cannot oppose their own country. Whether good or bad, they're still Russian, blah, blah, blah. On this, I am with Ukrainians. The only safe way to deal with this issue is to de-platform Russians from academic conferences, from public fora, unless they unequivocally denounce the war, denounce the occupation of the East and Crimea, denounce Putin and all his acolytes, and demonstrate that they are not earning any money from connections to that regime. And any Russians expressing chauvinist, expansionist, imperialist views should not only be deplatformed, but removed from the territory of the UK, the US, and the European Union, and sent back to the Mukhosransk or Balotistan that Moscow has become. And the story from the Kyiv Independent follows on from that rant that I've just given. It talks about now being the time for Russian athletes to be entirely excluded from the 2024 Olympic Games. The International Olympic Committee has announced on October the 12th that it will suspend the Russian Olympic Committee after it incorporated the regional sports organizations from the 4 territories illegally annexed from Ukraine. Bearing in mind, of course, that 2 of those territories are not fully occupied or controlled by Russians, but they lay claim to them nonetheless. In its statement, the IOC said that the ROC's inclusion of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia sports organizations, which are under the authority of Ukraine's National Olympic Committee, constitutes a breach of the Olympic Charter because it violates the territorial integrity of the NOC of Ukraine. This decision is to be welcomed, but it has taken months and months of pressure from the international community on the IOC to come to a decision which to most of us seemed to be obvious a long time ago. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, numerous organizations around the world have suspended Russian representatives to punish its behavior. That includes the International Federation of Association Football, the Council of Europe, and many others. But the IOC has wavered throughout this. In January, it concluded that no athlete should be prevented from competing just because of their passports. That meant that Russian and Belarusian athletes involved in the 2024 Games could compete still as so-called neutral athletes. But can sport be neutral? Ukrainians have been drawing our attention to the fact that many, many Russian athletes have connections to the military, that they are funded and supported by the Russian state. They may have siblings and family members in the army. Photographs, social media posts of some of them showing absolutely clear support for Russia's invasion and repeating the fascistic symbols and gestures that are associated with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Inviting Russian and Belarusian athletes to the 2024 Games risks normalizing Russia's war in Ukraine, writes the Kyiv Independent. Such a decision would reward Russian soldier athletes for their participation in the war, and it would falsely imply that Russia and its citizens can wage war and commit atrocities in a neighboring country without significant repercussions. It would also suggest the international community is no longer fully committed to opposing the full-scale war against Ukraine. And this is the absolutely critical thing. This is not about us projecting our so-called civilized values. We need to be thinking about how Russia will receive these propagandistic gifts, how they will leverage them, both for external and internal propaganda, and how they will also use them to try and normalize their relationships with countries around the world. There is no such thing as neutrality, and sport and culture cannot be considered distinct from the political sphere, cannot be divorced from Russia's barbaric, genocidal, terroristic actions, not just in Ukraine, but around the world. And two more stories I'd like to draw your attention to. They definitely deserve deeper reading. One of these in the Kyiv Independent goes into a lot of detail about how, as the Bakhmut counteroffensive lags, soldiers are becoming burnt out from the horrors of war. And these are some very human stories that are focused on in this article. For instance, more than a month after his first assault operation near Bakhmut, 23-year-old soldier Alexander Mikulak still blames himself for not saving a comrade. Mikulak's 15-man group was part of the 22nd Separate Mechanized Brigade and was able to clear the first Russian position thanks to powerful strikes by Ukrainian artillery. 9 soldiers advanced forward, including Mikulak. The rest stayed behind to defend the captured position, but things went wrong from there. They underestimated the number of Russian troops positioned around the next target, and his group became encircled. At that moment, his 25-year-old brother-in-arms, who was standing just 10 meters behind him, received a shrapnel injury and died soon after from blood loss. "I couldn't save him, and I've regretted it ever since," Mikulak is quoted as saying. Everyone in the group, including Mikulak, was wounded, but they were able to escape full encirclement. However, one of them was captured and taken away by the Russians. And this is just one story out of many hundreds of thousands of traumatic stories and memories that Ukrainian soldiers will be going through. And the article gives many other examples and also breaks down the progress of the Bakhmut counteroffensive. But we should remember, this will be the legacy of Russian aggression. Not just many, many lives cut short, but those who remain will have the physical, emotional, and mental scars of what Russia has inflicted upon them and their comrades. Another important article in the Kyiv Independent, and this is by Dinara Kalolova, and she gives a lot of detail about Ukrainian artists and writers who were killed by Russia's war, including ballet dancer Alexander Shapoval, artist and researcher of Ukrainian culture Olha Pavlenka, film editor Viktor Avdiivka, artist and fashion designer Lyubov Panchenko, conductor Yuri Karpatyenko, all killed by Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. And of course, those who've been watching this channel will also know about the extraordinary Ukrainian writer Victoria Amelina, who was also cut down in the prime of her creative youth by a Russian missile. It's worth recalling the words of Victoria Amelina that she penned in the foreword to the published diary of another author, Volodymyr Vakulenko, who was murdered during the Russian occupation of Izium. "My worst fear is coming true. I'm inside a new executed renaissance. As in the 1930s, Ukrainian artists are killed, their manuscripts disappear, and their memory is erased. This is not accidental. It is part and parcel of Russia's brutal invasion, the eradication of Ukrainian literature, culture, and the figures who are behind it." And shifting to the Moscow Times, I want to draw your attention to another fantastic article by Jade McGlynn. Not a week goes by, it seems, without her producing a truly phenomenal piece of work, and this one is no different. She writes here how Russian propaganda has built an alternative reality in occupied Ukraine. Now, there's lots of detail in here. I'll just read out a short paragraph from it, which is absolutely fascinating. Having isolated the territory of Donetsk and its people and placed them under digital surveillance, the Russians then reactivated FSB-handled local public opinion curators. Those are people who would stage pro-Moscow rallies. It also appointed collaborator officials and relaunched local pro-Russian social media accounts. Ukrainians living under occupation could acquaint themselves with the Russian alternate reality version of events through the newly installed Russian satellite television packages or via roving buses topped with loudspeakers that blared propaganda about Russian benevolence to starving Ukrainians queuing for hours for free bread and water. The Russian world is not just built on terror, torture, and coercion. It is also built on lies and distorted information. And this is a very important article that dissects how part of that information ecosystem is built and maintained to undermine the statehood of Ukraine and to brainwash the people living under Russian occupation. Now, here's just a few short stories from the Moscow Times I'll draw your attention to because I think they're quite interesting. Russian prosecutors seek 3-year jail term for the co-chair of the Memorial Group in Russia. That is probably one of the most prominent human rights organizations in Russia, which has now been banned and attempts have been made to disband it. Russian prosecutors are seeking a 3-year prison sentence for veteran human rights campaigner Oleg Orlov, who was fined by the Moscow court earlier this month after he wrote an article saying that Russia had become a fascist country under President Vladimir Putin. Orlov, who served as Memorial's co-chair, was fined 150,000 rubles, which is $1,500 earlier in October, for publicly opposing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and he was prosecuted under wartime censorship laws. Well, they're now seeking for a custodial sentence, and in Russia's weaponized judicial system, it's most likely that is what they will achieve. It's entirely clear now that if you are a genuine opponent of Putin, if you are a genuine critic, you will not be tolerated. You will either be silenced or placed in jail. The inverse of that is that anybody who is masquerading as opposition or an opponent of Putin's regime who is not in jail and whose views are still being heard is highly likely to actually be a hybrid puppet of the regime rather than a genuine opposition figure. It's a simple litmus test. We should not be deceived by regime puppets masquerading as freedom fighters. And as the screw tightens on the Russian economy, we should see yet more repression. And this is an interesting story from the Moscow Times. It talks about Russia raising interest rates to 15% based on fears of rising inflation. Russia's central bank raised interest rates from 13 to 15% on Friday, as it warned of higher than expected inflation across the country. The bank said that domestic demand was increasingly outpacing the provision of goods and services, while the pace of lending growth was invariably high. Economists also generally agree that Russia's economy is overheating, partly as a result of a rapid increase in government spending to fund its invasion of Ukraine. The economy has been heavily militarized since February 2022, with investment and the workforce redirected to boost the production of tanks, missiles, guns, and ammo. When you combine these increased wages within the military-industrial sector, as well as payments to people who have lost family members in the war, there is a lot more money sloshing around the economy and fewer goods on sale to meet those demands. Well, we will dissect this story in more detail during the next conversation with Konstantin Samarlov, who is an expert in these matters. And finally, 2 pieces, one from the Moscow Times and then one back to the Kyiv Independent. The Moscow Times asks, are Russians really living like there is no war? In the nearly 2 years since the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, a common criticism of Russians by outside observers has been that they largely continue to live their lives as if nothing serious is happening. Well, this article breaks that conception down in more detail and adds a lot of nuance to it. Of course, there are people who support the war. Of course, there are many said patriots. But as this article points out, as Jade McGlynn in her fantastic book points out as well, there is a huge spectrum of opinion, and it's probably not until the repressive state of affairs is lifted that we will truly understand what the full range of opinion is within the Russian public. And lastly, a fantastic opinion piece, an activist story from the Kyiv Independent, written by Anastasia Fedyuk and Yuri Gorodnichenko, as well as Ayona Sologub. This is from October the 19th. And the opinion piece states Russia's defeat must be the goal of Western democracies. The article makes a strong case, saying proposals for peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are pointless and dangerous. The Kremlin will not offer peace in exchange for Ukrainian territories because its goal is not territorial, but the elimination of Ukraine on the way to completing Russia's historical mission of destroying the decadent West. Now, this is a fantastic article which dissects things like talk of negotiations or a frozen conflict as being pointless and dangerous. Russia's assault, the article states, on democracies is undeniable. It supports far-right political parties and populists in the West. It meddles in elections. It deepens the divides within and between countries. It spreads disinformation, monopolizes critical markets such as energy, and corrupts Western elites, including in France, Germany, and Austria. Meanwhile, Russia has already found ways to circumvent sanctions and secure the necessary parts and equipment for weapons, while such support from China, Iran, North Korea will likely increase. The article argues that only a strategic defeat of Russia can stop this cancer from spreading, and asks, why then are many Western leaders allergic to this prescription? I cannot disagree with that sentiment and strongly recommend you read the full article. That's the end of this episode. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. And if you want any questions to be answered or any topics to be covered in this segment, please do reach out in the comments.